Imagine waking up to find out that the political anger in your streets, the election you just voted in, and the heat wave that's literally melting your city's roads are all colliding on this exact day. And they're all driven by the collapse of our basic civic guardrails. Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claireandhoratio.com. Today is Tuesday, June 30, 2026.
And we are looking at a really profound set of civic frictions today. These are things operating on completely different tracks globally, but they're all coming to a head right now.
Well, we're going to start immediately with the rapidly escalating crisis in South Africa because as of today, an unauthorized deadline set by citizen-led anti-migrant groups has expired. They are demanding that all undocumented foreigners leave the country immediately, and the physical reality on the ground is deteriorating very quickly.
It is incredibly tense. So in Johannesburg and Durban, thousands of people are actively marching today. You've got protesters in Durban outfitted in traditional warrior attire, carrying fighting sticks, leopard skins, shields, and they're openly calling for mass deportations. Police have deployed heavily across these urban centers, and they're already confirming multiple arrests as isolated looting targets migrant-owned businesses.
But the root of this unrest is not sudden at all. It stems from a staggering unemployment rate that is hovering around 33%. So you have this deep structural inequality that has left millions of South Africans frustrated, and these citizen-led vigilante groups have essentially weaponized that anger. They are specifically blaming migrants from countries like Malawi and Zimbabwe for crime and strained public services. Groups operating under banners like March and March are demanding the government spend the next 6 months forcibly removing anyone who remains.
And the severity of that threat has actually forced neighboring governments to intervene. Nigeria and Malawi are right now actively chartering planes and doses to repatriate their citizens. These are individuals who have been, suddenly evicted by landlords or abruptly fired by employers who are terrified of violent reprisals from these vigilante groups.
It's a situation where the state's failure to address economic disparities has created a power vacuum, and vigilantism is filling that void. But I want to contrast this immediate physical crisis with the administrative approach unfolding in Spain today. The Spanish government just closed the registration period for a massive regularization scheme, and over 1 million undocumented migrants applied for legal status. That is double the 500,000 the government initially anticipated.
Right, and Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is positioning this entirely as a mathematical necessity, not a humanitarian gesture. His administration calculates that without migrant labor, Spain's GDP will plummet by 19% by the year 2050. The demographic collapse looming over Spain is severe.
So the argument is that without an influx of new legal residents, 90,000 bars will close, hundreds of thousands of classrooms will sit empty, and over 200,000 farms will just disappear.
Exactly. The strategy is to utilize migration as an economic engine, one that's literally required to fund the nation's aging welfare state.
But framing human beings primarily as economic levers invites a massive dose of skepticism, doesn't it? Treating migrants as a demographic spreadsheet fix might just be masking the exact same underlying resource and public service anxieties that have just boiled over into outright violence in South Africa. When a government attempts a top-down administrative solution to a demographic decline, they still have to contend with the physical reality of local infrastructure.
And the political backlash in Spain highlights that exact friction. Conservative and far-right opposition parties, specifically the PP and Vox, are fiercely resisting the regularization. They argue that instantly integrating 1 million new legal residents will completely overwhelm public services like healthcare and housing. Regional governments are even taking the matter to the European Court of Justice over this.
Even with Spain rolling out a €500 million integration plan, the public just remains unconvinced that the infrastructure can absorb that kind of sudden shift. For more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit claireandhoratio.com. Shifting from the physical movement of people to the digital movement of information, our sources highlight how populations are being actively manipulated ahead of the ballot box. Colombia recently concluded a razor-thin election where far-right candidate Abelardo de la Espriella defeated the leftist Iván Cepeda. And outgoing President Gustavo Petro is now making serious allegations that United States political forces, specifically Donald Trump, interfered through data manipulation and disinformation.
Petro's allegations point to the modern mechanics of transnational digital interference. So this isn't about hacking voting machines. It is about manipulating the information environment that voters inhabit before they ever cast a ballot. We observed similar tactics in Honduras, where millions of targeted text messages were allegedly sent to voters who receive U.S. remittances, basically threatening that electing a left-wing candidate would sever their cash pipeline.
And in Argentina, Javier Milei's election was similarly bolstered by overt financial bullying from Washington. This demonstrates a pretty terrifying reality about our political infrastructure. Telecom networks, social media platforms, and data brokers are entirely privately owned and poorly regulated. Foreign actors do not need to deploy armies anymore. They just need to purchase access to private networks to change voters' minds.
And the weaponization of that trust is happening on U.S. soil, too. Look at the New York courtroom, where Chinese tycoon Guo Wengui has just been sentenced to 30 years in prison. Guo operated a billion-dollar scam by reinventing himself as a political dissident. He aligned himself with figures like Steve Bannon to actively prey on the trust of his online followers, people who were desperately seeking democracy in China.
He diverted their investments, which were supposed to fund an anti-communist movement, directly into his own pockets to purchase a $37 million yacht and a $1 million Lamborghini. Guo basically capitalized on a deeply vulnerable information ecosystem. People seeking alternative political movements are highly susceptible to manipulation, and that vulnerability is the core focus of the newly released 2026 Reuters Digital News Report. They surveyed roughly 100,000 people across 48 countries and identified a really disturbing behavioral shift.
Yeah, young people are just abandoning traditional news platforms entirely. They are migrating to social media spaces like TikTok and YouTube, where trust in the information consumed is ironically at its absolute lowest. The mechanics of how people receive information on those platforms are changing so rapidly.
Well, the report notes that 10% of users are now relying directly on artificial intelligence chatbots for their news. That creates an environment completely ripe for coordinated bot networks. Take the recent viral fake video claiming a Russian airstrike killed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The footage was actually from a 2015 warehouse explosion in Tianjin, China.
But the AI-generated context wrapped around that old footage made it convincing enough to garner millions of views. It was amplified by bot accounts masquerading as official military sources. And this brings us directly to the warnings raised by Google DeepMind philosopher Ayas and Gabriel regarding AI alignment. Gabriel argues that aligning an AI to human values is a complex navigation of competing desires, not just a simple mathematical optimization problem.
His framework suggests alignment is a four-way relationship involving the AI system, the user, the developer, and society at large. The current structural flaw is that the developer and the algorithm hold disproportionate power. If highly fluent AI systems are optimizing purely for user engagement, they're inherently going to prioritize sensationalism or sycophancy over accuracy. Outrage holds user attention significantly longer than nuanced truth.
Which raises the ultimate question: how does a democracy protect its citizens from transnational disinformation without the government tipping over into authoritarian censorship? The line between protecting the digital infrastructure of truth and policing speech is dangerously thin.
When private networks become political weapons, the lack of societal oversight leaves democratic institutions entirely exposed. The Rycroft Review into Electoral Influence confirms that the old model of foreign enemies cultivating lobbyists is obsolete. The new threat matrix features billionaires, data brokers, cryptocurrency, and AI.
And the vulnerability of our democratic information systems naturally forces an examination of how executive power is structured, checked, and held accountable when governance begins to fail. In Senegal right now, an escalating power struggle has triggered a severe constitutional crisis. Lawmakers overwhelmingly passed a reform that drastically curbs the powers of President Bassirou Diomaye Faye while simultaneously expanding parliamentary oversight.
The mechanics of this crisis are driven by a bitter personal rivalry. President Faye's former ally, Ousmane Sonko, was fired as prime minister and subsequently elected as Speaker of the National Assembly. So Sonko is now using his pay-stuff party's massive parliamentary majority. They control 130 of the 165 seats to rewrite the rules of governance.
The specific constitutional amendments are aggressive, to put it mildly. They prevent a sitting president from leading a political party, bar the executive from signing certain acts between an election and inauguration, and expand the Constitutional Court from 7 to 9 members.
The opposition views this entirely as an act of political revenge rather than a genuine effort to balance the separation of powers. The tension has broken out into physical conflict, with police firing tear gas at protesters outside the parliament building in Dakar. We are literally watching the concept of governmental guardrails being dismantled and weaponized in real time.
It's striking because this institutional dynamic really mirrors the economic legacy of former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, who has died at the age of 100. For nearly 2 decades, Greenspan was hailed as an economic maestro who steered the United States through unprecedented prosperity using a policy of cheap money, which became famously known as the Greenspan Put.
The mechanism of the Greenspan put was essentially an unwritten insurance policy for Wall Street. Financial markets believed that if major risks threatened the economy, Greenspan would aggressively lower interest rates to flood the system with liquidity. He operated on a fundamental belief in extreme deregulation and self-correcting markets, which was heavily influenced by the laissez-faire philosophy of Ayn Rand.
He just assumed that financial institutions, acting rationally in their own self-interest, would naturally protect their shareholders and the broader economy from collapse.
But by removing the penalty for failure, he incentivized banks to take massive gambles. After the September 11 attacks, he dropped the key interest rate to 1%, a 46-year low. That massive injection of cheap money allowed risky banking behaviors, particularly the unchecked bundling of subprime mortgages, to flourish.
Right, and he later became the face of the 2008 financial crisis, famously admitting to a Senate committee that he was in a state of shocked disbelief when his ideological framework collapsed and Wall Street failed to self-regulate. Both the Senegal constitutional crisis and the Greenspan legacy hinge on this assumption of rational behavior.
Greenspan assumed markets would act rationally to preserve themselves, and Senegal's constitution assumed the executive and legislative branches would act rationally in the interest of the state. In both cases, the actors engaged in a zero-sum pursuit of power or profit. Think of this in terms of structural engineering. Greenspan's monetary policy was like knocking out the load-bearing walls of a house, operating on the blind faith that the roof would just magically float.
And looking at Senegal today, the legislature is doing the exact opposite. They are rapidly pouring concrete walls right in the middle of the living room to stop the ceiling from falling, effectively paralyzing the entire house. Both extremes demonstrate the immense danger of unbalanced power.
When guardrails are either completely dismantled or weaponized for political retribution, the public ultimately bears the cost of the resulting collapse. And while politicians debate these constitutional limits and economic frameworks, the physical limits of the planet are imposing unavoidable realities today. Germany is dealing with severe political fallout following a weekend of record-breaking temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 104 degrees Fahrenheit.
The civic impact in Germany is immediate and structural. Trains are halted due to warped tracks, roads are physically cracking under the heat, and highly vulnerable nursing homes are operating without air conditioning. This is not just a weather event, it is a profound failure of public infrastructure.
Yet the German response is currently defined by bureaucratic paralysis. Environment Minister Carsten Schneider claims the federal government is legally prohibited by the Basic Law from directly funding local heat protections.
So the political debate is completely fractured. You have Greenpeace proposing an environmental tax on billionaires to fund necessary water-retaining green spaces. Meanwhile, Green Party leader Felix Benazek is demanding the removal of red tape to provide emergency support for vulnerable facilities. The government approved an infrastructure program last year with billions available, but jurisdictional friction is preventing those funds from mitigating the life-threatening heat.
We continually see governments treat predictable, systemic climate changes as sudden, unpredictable emergencies. Germany's failing infrastructure requires massive overhauls, not a debate over which level of government is legally allowed to pay for an air conditioner. The refusal to treat climate adaptation as a permanent baseline requirement of governance is a massive failure of foresight.
And the mechanics of Germany's current heat crisis are undeniably man-made. Between 2021 and 2024, Germany sealed over 50 hectares of land daily. The soil is covered with concrete and asphalt, preventing water from evaporating and cooling the urban environment. They actively built the urban heat islands they are suffering in today.
That paralysis extends directly into long-term energy decisions as well. In the United Kingdom, prospective Prime Minister Andy Burnham is facing fierce pressure from Labour MPs to permanently block the development of the Rosebank North Sea oil field. Developing this field would extract oil that produces 250 million tons of carbon dioxide, which equals roughly 70% of the United Kingdom's annual emissions.
The argument against Rosebank relies on basic market mechanics. The International Energy Agency confirms that drilling this specific field will not lower global oil prices, because oil is traded on an international market, and the extracted resources will simply be sold to the highest bidder globally. Furthermore, the fossil fuel sector has been shedding tens of thousands of workers for over a decade, so it does not even secure long-term domestic employment.
Adding that volume of carbon to the atmosphere directly exacerbates the extreme weather we are witnessing globally. To put the stakes in perspective, India has just recorded its fifth driest June in over a century. Monsoon rainfall is nearly 40% below average. This severely threatens the nation's critical agricultural sector, directly delaying the planting of staple crops like rice, corn, and cotton.
The persistence in treating the symptoms like drought in India or heat waves in Germany as anomalies, while continuing to debate new fossil fuel extraction like Rosebank, highlights how misaligned institutional priorities are with physical reality. The UK green economy is already worth roughly $134 billion, yet the debate over legacy fossil fuels continues to dominate the political bandwidth.
The stories we have examined today highlight several distinct, intense pressures moving in entirely different directions. We are watching physical demographic shifts spark violence in South Africa and political resistance in Spain. We are seeing digital information warfare manipulate elections in the Americas. We are witnessing institutional power struggles paralyze governance in Senegal, and we are feeling the heavy physical toll of climate realities buckle infrastructure in Germany and India.
These parallel tracks of civic friction demand structural responses from governments that are struggling merely to maintain the status quo. A failure on one track inevitably compounds the stress on the others. When the physical world becomes hostile through extreme heat or agricultural failure, the resulting economic anxiety frequently bleeds into the kind of anti-migrant violence we see in Johannesburg today.
That compounding stress brings us to a final thought regarding the intersection of Alan Greenspan's legacy and our digital information crisis. The global financial system nearly collapsed in 2008 because we placed blind faith in markets to self-regulate and prioritize the public interest over short-term profit. But consider the AI alignment issues we discussed earlier. What if the next catastrophic global crash isn't financial, but epistemological?
If we deregulate reality the way Greenspan deregulated mortgages, trusting private tech developers to self-regulate the digital infrastructure of truth, the resulting bankruptcy will be in foundational societal trust.
And unlike toxic mortgages, you cannot simply bail out a society that can no longer agree on basic reality. The stakes of leaving our informational guardrails in the hands of algorithms optimized for engagement could far exceed the damage of a market crash. The decisions made today regarding digital oversight will define the stability of democratic institutions for decades. For more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit claranarratio.com. Thank you for listening.